Hayek did a lot of work on this, but the project wasn't completed. However, out of it emerged his counter-revolution of science, his scientism and the study of society, his individualism true and false, and also his road to serfdom. Much could be said about this work of Hayek's, and, for example, about what it was that explained the oddity of his spending so much time on the discussion of the Saint-Simonians and on the way in which engineering and science-based ideas influence them towards something that looks a little bit like Fabian socialism. However, I have, for reasons of time, to spare you that on this occasion. I would rather like to turn to differences between Popper and Hayek. They clearly saw that their views were in some respects close, but in correspondence with others, they noted that there were political differences between them. Hayek thought that Popper was still too much influenced by his former socialism, while Popper initially tried to interpret Hayek's views as being as close to his own as he could, stressing those themes where there were commonalities and kind of downplaying a bit the other stuff. But he and Gombrich clearly had misgivings, I think, about the political company that Hayek kept, and I think some misgivings altogether about Hayek's more conservative and definitely classical liberal views. It seems to me, however, that while they had common concerns, and while they made similar criticisms of common opponents, there were some key intellectual differences between them. Hayek's views were dominated by a picture of an economic and legal order that operated in a systematic manner. And while he allowed for a limited welfare state and for governmental intervention of various kinds, Hayek's major concern was to limit this, and also to make sure that governmental intervention only took place in ways that didn't adversely affect the workings of the economic and legal systems, and thus, on Hayek's account, jeopardize people's well-being and liberty. By contrast with this, central for Popper is a picture in which the state guarantees both negative rights and also certain positive rights. Popper stresses the unintended consequences of human action, including the unintended consequences of governmental action. But what for him is to play a central role are government initiatives taking the form of what Popper called piecemeal social engineering, to be controlled by critical feedback from citizens. These initiatives, however, must be made in ways compatible with the rights of citizens and with the rule of law. Popper acknowledged the kinds of issues about knowledge, which in Hayek's arguments, for example, when he's posing problems for economic calculation under socialism, these things were so central in Hayek. But while Popper refers to these things, for him, as for Keynes, they were basically something which, in Popper's case, his piecemeal social engineers simply needed to be aware of. One might then think, but why were Hayek and Popper not at odds? And why didn't they criticize one another in their work? In large part, I think this was because of the setting. In a political world dominated by advocates of a planned society, they found themselves allies. They both also recognized that it was important to try to form an alliance between all those who were concerned with individual liberty and were opponents of totalitarianism. They also did agree about a lot of things. At the same time, Popper was, in unpublished material, quite critical of Hayek. He disagreed with Hayek's criticisms of social justice. In particular, I think Popper's view was that we could come to a kind of common agreement about those things which were posing the most urgent problems, the most urgent forms of suffering, and that it was perfectly reasonable that the government should be taking actions to remedy these. Popper not only disagreed with Hayek, but he also thought that for Hayek to criticize the idea of social justice, that just to give voice to such criticism would have the result that many people might dismiss what Popper thought were the very important things that Hayek had to say. Popper was also critical, as was Hayek's one-time ally Lionel Robbins, of Hayek's various criticisms of rationalism. Popper agreed that there were problems about the versions of rationalism that Hayek criticized. But at the same time, Popper thought that his own so-called critical rationalism wasn't hit by Hayek's points, and I think was a little disappointed that Hayek didn't make reference to such a thing. At the same time, Popper thought that criticism of rationalism as such was dangerous and problematic, and that Hayek was not wise to be voicing it. Popper didn't publish these things. I feel sure because of his feeling of personal indebtedness to Hayek. Hayek had, in Popper's view, rescued him twice. First of all, by actually getting Popper's Open Society to be published by Routledge. It was placed with Routledge on Hayek's recommendation. And second, by getting Popper a job at the LSE. Popper had been teaching in New Zealand during the Second World War. He found the atmosphere there somewhat hostile to his research, and he felt really that he was simply stuck in New Zealand, and Hayek did a lot to fix his getting an appointment at the LSE. This, and I think it was a pattern with Popper, then I think led to his being unwilling to make criticisms of his old friend in print, and I believe it was also responsible, for example, for his extreme unwillingness to tell Hayek what he actually thought of his work on the sensory order, despite Hayek pretty much begging him for comments. And what about Hayek? I haven't so far found criticism of Popper in the Hayek archive. I think that Hayek found Popper useful as an ally. However, I think it wouldn't be difficult to imagine what Hayek would have made in terms of criticism of some of Popper's ideas. For example, after the Second World War, Popper and Carnap from the Vienna Circle, but who was then in America, were corresponding. In the course of this, Popper mentioned Hayek in favorable terms. Carnap, who had been and still was a socialist, was surprised, and then questioned Popper as to whether he was still a socialist. Popper's response, which he wrote in January 1947, is now available in the collection of Popper's papers called After the Open Society, and his response was striking. For Popper indicated that while he was no longer a socialist and was critical of socialist ideas about social ownership, his view about such things was very much an experimental one, and he was certainly willing to consider small-scale experiments in socialization, for example, the socialization of particular monopolies if they couldn't be broken up. Popper's views were nuanced, but they were hardly views with which Hayek would have had much sympathy. The character of Popper's responses to Carnap discloses, I believe, two key differences between him and Hayek. First, there is no feel for the economic and legal order as a system of the kind that permeates Hayek's work. Second, Popper clearly didn't have the kind of optimism about markets and spontaneous order which is so important in Hayek. Popper stresses our ignorance and fallibility and unintended consequences, but for him, the key response is by way of governmental initiatives controlled by critical feedback. Popper agrees with Hayek's points about knowledge and the importance of an impersonal order rather than acting simply by way of the individual discretion of officials. But for Popper, such issues are typically things which need to inform the character of the activities of those engaged in piecemeal social engineering. We know that Popper gave a copy of his letter to Carnap to Hayek. We don't know how or whether Hayek responded. It's sad that we don't have such a response, as I think it might have made for very interesting reading. At the same time, it's possibly a good thing that Hayek didn't say to Popper what he's likely to have thought about Popper's views on these issues, as it could well have led to the end of an important friendship. I think that it is important that we pay attention to the different and contrasting ideas of Popper and of Hayek. In my view, we shouldn't simply equate their views. They each in certain ways complement the work of the other, both in philosophy and in politics. And while there are tensions between their views, I believe that thinking about where they disagree and why may be challenging, and may lead us to concerns which we are better for thinking about, concerning both purely intellectual issues and liberty. I believe that it will be in grappling with the heritage of these two thinkers, including their disagreements, that we may be led on to ideas which might lead to advances over what either of them said individually. Thank you very much.